Welcome to the CEH Geoengineering in Lakes, a Call for Consensus conference. My name's Stephen Mabley. I'm at the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology at Lancaster, and I'm in charge of session 1, the need for geoengineering lakes and forecasting their unintended consequences. So lakes are appreciated by many people for their aesthetic qualities, and these are one of many ecosystems, goods and services, the current jargon meaning really benefits to humanity that lakes supply. So in addition, they are important for water supply, energy supply, flood control, in many countries food, etc. The problem with lakes is they're very sensitive systems. They're affected by external factors like climate change, nutrient enrichment, acid deposition, and their food webs are very susceptible to disruption by invasive species. This idea is captured here in this diagram of a pelagic food web. We have a hierarchy of external stressors operating at different spatial scales, globally, regionally and locally, and they affect different parts of the pelagic food web. And these trigger a kind of complex series of bottom-up interactions and top-down interactions which alter the structure and the function of the system. Nutrient enrichment is, I guess, the most frequent effect of humanity on lakes. Phosphorus enrichment is fairly ubiquitous, and nitrogen enrichment is also widespread. And the internal interactions that they trigger are typically things such as increasing the phytoplankton biomass, changing the species composition towards typically cyanobacteria, which can be toxic, causing the loss of macrophytes. This is the case in shallow lakes, causing oxygen depletion at depth, which can cause fish kills and also can promote phosphorus cycling back out of the sediment, back into the water, which is very relevant to this particular topic. So these are just some of the causes of increased external nutrient load. Typically, they're to do with our agriculture. And so, for example, we destroy the natural vegetation, which is a complicated ecosystem developed over many years, which is very good at retaining nutrients. And we destroy it, make a simpler system, perhaps for agriculture, maybe for forestry, and it has a much lower capacity to retain nutrients. We want to increase food production, so we apply fertilizers, increasing the availability of nutrients in the land and inevitably then in the water. Farm animals, if their waste isn't managed well, then that can get more directly into the water, causing nutrient enrichment. And finally, our own waste can get into the water and cause nutrient enrichment. And of course, human populations are growing, increasing the pressure on all the ecosystems around the world. And then the final one is to do with atmospheric fossil fuel emissions, but that can also lead to nitrogen deposition in precipitation. So as I said, agriculture or food production is really one of the main causes of poor water quality and increased nutrient load. So there's a tension here between producing food and having clean water and healthy ecosystems. And then the second issue here is that lakes are depositional environments and they store materials, including nutrients that have come off the catchment. But disturbance, physical disturbance, or chemical changes like anoxia at the sediment surface can release those nutrients, particularly phosphorus, back into the water. Although we think about phosphorus a lot, it's not the only resource that limits the productivity of a lake. So there's a lot of work rediscovering really that nitrogen is also important. And so this is on the left-hand side, there's a graph here based on a meta-analysis of several hundred showing that the strength of the effect of nitrogen is pretty similar to the strength of the effect of phosphorus. And in fact, many systems respond most strongly to both nitrogen and phosphorus together. And the two panels on the right-hand side are for rather dark brown water systems, very low light, and they show that fish production isn't affected by phosphorus, it's strongly affected by light availability. So we do need to remember that phosphorus isn't the only limiting nutrient. Brian Spears, in his overall introduction, showed this diagram showing estimates of recovery time from different parts of the catchment and different parts and for the different waters such as the lake. And you can see that they're taking place over decades or maybe centuries. And there's a tension here between our need under the Water Framework Directive in Europe to bring its inland waters into good ecological status by next year, in fact, 2015. And this snapshot for UK inland waters from, I think, 2009 shows that more than 50% of these different types of waters are not at good ecological status. So generally, if we increase the nutrient load in a shallow lake, we will move from a system dominated by benthic primary producers, the macrophytes, to pelagic primary producers, the phytoplankton. But this transfer isn't a linear process. And it's not a linear process because there are feedbacks within each of these stable states which maintains that particular state. So macrophytes, for example, tend to harvest the nutrients. They have access to nutrients in the sediment, which gives them advantages at low nutrient availabilities. They can take up nutrients from the water. They can provide habitats for grazers, maintaining their own state and preventing the shift to the phytoplankton-dominated state. As we increase the nutrient availability, we will eventually shift to the phytoplankton-dominated state, and that has a series of internal feedbacks as well. For example, they can shade the benthic plants, and they can potentially carbon compete them as well. What this means is, as if we then reduce the nutrient load back to try and regain the clear water macrophyte dominated state, we have to push the nutrient availability to a much lower level than we had to switch it back forward to the phytoplankton. So this critical nutrient availability depends on the state that you're in. So there's potentially an argument here for remediation, where you can maybe use a remediation process to trigger that shift back to the macrophyte dominated state, and then let the lake do the work itself. Well, I mentioned challenges and conflicts, and the first one is this business of how do we produce and maintain lakes with high ecological structure, doing all the functions we want and require, but also produce food for a growing population. So there's tension there. The second one is to do with time. Time scales of recovery from legacy phosphorus are much longer than the time scales that we need to work on for legislation for the Water Framework Directive. Not all lakes is it appropriate to remediate phosphorus. Maybe they're nitrogen limited systems, maybe they're light limited systems, or maybe the external load from the catchment is so high that it's not appropriate to worry about the internal phosphorus. And then finally, how to ensure that the remedial medicine is less damaging than the ecological malady. So maybe the treatment itself will actually be more damaging than the problem we're trying to fix in terms of eutrophication. So we've got three people with hopefully different views about this. We've got an academic, Brian Moss from Liverpool University. We have another academic, but a macrophyte ecologist from China, Li Wei. And then we have a regulator, Jeff Phillips. And we're aware that this is a contentious issue potentially, and because of that we've tried to select people with different views. But also we value your view. What do you think about this issue? So please, if you can, get involved and put in your ideas so that we can eventually come to a consensus as the best way forward. Thank you for your attention.